Merry Christmas, or rather, a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone, belief system, or current state of consciousness. Regardless, we proceed. Today's video has one small, insignificant Christmas detail hidden somewhere in the middle. You probably won't notice it or care, but it's there, like dust on a windowsill or the sound of your own breathing, which you're now aware of. Sorry about that. This may be the most boring video ever made. Not intentionally boring, that would suggest effort. No, this is accidentally boring in the way that only meticulously researched historical documentation can achieve. Have you ever wondered what medieval people did when they wanted to celebrate the birth of Christ in a dimly lit room that smelled of fermented grain and unwashed bodies? Neither have we. Yet, here we are. We're about to spend the next 2 hours exploring something that happened 700 years ago to people whose names we'll mispronounce, in places that no longer exist, during a time period that most historians agree was probably terrible. If you're still here in 30 minutes, you clearly have too much free time. If you're here in 2 hours, we're genuinely concerned about your life choices. Subscribe if you're still awake. Or don't. It changes nothing. To understand medieval tavern Christmas parties, and I use the term parties with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for describing root canal surgery, we must first establish the historical context, which is to say we must bore you with approximately 4,000 words of background information that you didn't ask for and probably don't need. Let us begin with the year 1066, not because it's particularly relevant to Christmas parties, but because it's the only medieval date most people remember. William the Conqueror had just conquered England. Though he probably would have preferred a nice cup of tea and a biscuit, the Norman conquest brought with it new drinking customs, new taxation systems, and new ways to make already miserable lives marginally more miserable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To truly understand medieval Christmas celebrations in taverns, we must first examine the etymology of the word tavern itself. The word derives from the Latin taberna, meaning shop or hut. Thrilling stuff, I know. Try to contain your excitement. The earliest recorded use of taberna in the context of alcohol consumption dates to approximately 194 BC, when Roman soldiers needed somewhere to drink wine that tasted like vinegar and complain about their feet. This tradition of drinking terrible alcohol while complaining about various body parts would continue unbroken through the medieval period and, arguably, into the present day. Moving forward several centuries, because frankly, Roman drinking habits are only marginally more interesting than watching paint dry on a humid day, we encounter the medieval period proper. Historians typically date the medieval period from approximately 476 AD to 1453 AD, though these dates are as arbitrary as the nutritional information on a package of medieval bread, which is to say, largely meaningless. The early medieval period, sometimes called the Dark Ages, though this name has fallen out of favor among historians who apparently think Dark Ages sounds too exciting, was characterized by what scholars politely term economic reorganization. What they mean is that civilization had essentially collapsed, and most people were too busy trying not to die of plague, famine, or casual violence to worry about holiday celebrations. Christmas itself was not always celebrated on December 25th. Early Christians celebrated the birth of Christ on various dates, including January 6th, March 25th, and presumably several Tuesdays that nobody bothered to record. Pope Julius the Fierce, not to be confused with Julius Caesar, though both were dead Romans, officially designated December 25th as Christmas sometime in the 4th century AD. His reasons for this choice are lost to history, though it was likely either deeply theological or based on whoever had the loudest voice at the church meeting that day. The choice of December 25th conveniently coincided with several pagan winter festivals, including Saturnalia, Sol Invictus, and various other celebrations that involved drinking, eating, and generally behaving in ways that would later be considered sinful. This was either a brilliant stroke of religious diplomacy or a cosmic coincidence. Historians lean toward the former, though they would, wouldn't they? Now, about those taverns. Medieval taverns were not the cozy, romanticized establishments portrayed in modern fantasy literature. They were, to put it charitably, functional. Most taverns were simply the front rooms of private houses, where the proprietor, usually a woman, as brewing was considered women's work until it became profitable, sold ale to anyone with sufficient coins and insufficient sense. The typical medieval tavern consisted of one large room with a dirt floor, several rough wooden tables, and benches that had seen better decades. The walls were usually made of wattle and daub, a construction technique that sounds far more sophisticated than it actually was. Wattle and daub consisted of wooden strips woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal. Dung, yes, dung. Medieval architects were not known for their squeamishness. Lighting was provided by candles made from animal fat, which produced a dim, flickering illumination and a smell that can only be described as unfortunate. Ventilation was achieved by leaving gaps in the construction, which also served to let in rain, snow, and various small animals. Heating was provided by a central fire pit, which filled the room with smoke and created a permanent haze that probably improved the appearance of both the food and the other patrons. The proprietor of a medieval tavern was required to obtain a license from local authorities, assuming local authorities existed and were sober enough to issue licenses. This license cost money, which the proprietor typically didn't have, leading to a complex system of bribes, favors, and what medieval people euphemistically called arrangements. These arrangements usually involved providing free drinks to officials, which explains why medieval government records are often illegible. Ale was the primary beverage served in medieval taverns, not because it was particularly good, but because water was often contaminated with substances that would make a modern health inspector faint. Medieval ale was weak, cloudy, and had a taste that contemporary accounts describe as acceptable or better than nothing. It was brewed from barley, wheat, or oats, depending on what was available and how desperate the brewer had become. The brewing process itself was surprisingly complex for something that tasted like disappointment. Grains were malted by soaking them in water until they sprouted, then dried in kilns that were essentially controlled fires. The malted grains were then mixed with hot water in large wooden vats, creating a substance called wort. Yeast was added, though medieval brewers didn't understand yeast and attributed fermentation to divine intervention or witchcraft, and the mixture was left to ferment for several days. Quality control was minimal. Each batch of ale tasted different from the last, and not necessarily better. Some batches were contaminated with bacteria that produced interesting flavors ranging from slightly sour to definitely poisonous. Medieval people learned to live with this uncertainty, much as they learned to live with everything else that was terrible about medieval life. The price of ale was regulated by local authorities through a system called a size of ale, which sounds official but was essentially medieval price fixing. The price was supposed to correlate with the price of grain, but tavern keepers routinely ignored these regulations and charged whatever they thought they could get away with. This led to frequent disputes between tavern keepers and customers, which were usually resolved through methods that would not be admissible in modern courts. Medieval tavern customers represented a cross-section of society united by their shared desire to consume alcohol in unpleasant surroundings. Regular patrons included local craftsmen, farmers, merchants, traveling clergy, professional soldiers, and what medieval records diplomatically refer to as persons of uncertain occupation. These persons of uncertain occupation were often thieves, prostitutes, or individuals who had fled from their previous lives due to circumstances that were probably illegal. Seating arrangements in medieval taverns followed no particular system. Customers sat wherever they could find space, often sharing benches with complete strangers who might or might not be planning to rob them. Personal space was not a medieval concept. People sat close together, partly for warmth, partly because there wasn't enough room to spread out, and partly because medieval people had different standards of personal hygiene. Food was available in most taverns, though the term food requires some clarification. Medieval tavern meals consisted primarily of bread, cheese, and whatever meat was available, and hadn't gone completely bad. The bread was dense, dark, and often contained ingredients that modern people would not consider edible. The cheese was usually local, which meant it tasted like whatever the local cows had been eating. The meat was of uncertain origin and uncertain age. Cooking facilities in medieval taverns were basic. Most food was boiled in large pots over the central fire, creating stews that were more about survival than flavor. Seasoning was minimal, partly because spices were expensive, and partly because medieval people had different expectations about food. The general attitude toward food was summed up by a 14th century writer who observed that it is better to eat poorly than not to eat at all, which gives you some idea of medieval culinary ambitions. The medieval Christmas season, which we'll eventually discuss, I promise, officially began on December 25th and lasted until Epiphany on January 6th. This 12-day period was known as Christmastide, though medieval people called it various names depending on their local dialect and level of education. During this period, normal work was supposed to cease, though this rule was honored more in the breach than the observance. The celebration of Christmas in medieval times was complicated by the fact that medieval people had complex and often contradictory attitudes towards celebration itself. The church taught that excessive merriment was sinful, but also encouraged celebration of Christ's birth. Local customs varied widely, and what was considered appropriate celebration in one village might be considered scandalous heresy in the next. Christmas traditions in medieval England were heavily influenced by pre-Christian customs that had been officially abandoned, but unofficially continued. These included wassailing, mumming, and various other practices that involved drinking, singing, and behaving in ways that the church found doctrinally questionable. The church's solution was to condemn these practices while simultaneously incorporating them into official celebrations, a compromise that satisfied no one, but allowed everyone to continue doing what they were going to do anyway. We'll return to Christmas celebrations later, but first, something completely unrelated that you absolutely need to know to understand medieval tavern Christmas parties: the economic history of medieval brewing guilds. If you're one of the 7 people still watching, comment Emperor Blandicus below. Now that we've established the absolutely essential background of medieval tavern construction and Roman etymology, information you'll surely use at dinner parties, we must delve deeper into the labyrinthine world of medieval brewing regulations. This is crucial to understanding Christmas parties, though the connection won't become clear until approximately never. The Guild of Brewers was established in London in 1342, though similar organizations existed throughout Europe with names that would challenge any modern spell check program. The Zunft der Bierbrauer in Germanic regions, Les Brasseurs in France, and the wonderfully named Corporazione dei Birrai in Italy all served the same essential function, making sure that brewing remained as complicated and expensive as possible. Guild. Membership required payment of substantial fees, completion of a 7-year apprenticeship, and proof that one was not Jewish, foreign, or excessively intelligent. The apprenticeship process itself deserves detailed examination, though I warn you that it's even more tedious than it sounds. Medieval brewing apprentices, typically boys between 12 and 14, because child labor laws had not yet been invented, began their careers by cleaning brewing equipment with methods that would horrify modern health inspectors. They used sand, wood ash, and prayers to remove residue from wooden barrels, creating a cleaning solution that was probably more dangerous than the original contamination. After mastering the art of inadequate sanitation, apprentices learned to identify different types of grain. This sounds simple until you realize that medieval grain classification included dozens of varieties with names like spelt, emmer, and einkorn, grains that have since been abandoned by civilization for being insufficiently productive. Apprentices were required to memorize the characteristics of each grain type, their optimal growing conditions, and their effects on the final product. The 3rd year of apprenticeship involved learning to operate a mill, which was typically powered by water, wind, or extremely patient oxen. Water mills required understanding of medieval hydraulic engineering, a field that combined equal parts genius and luck. Medieval millers diverted streams through wooden channels that occasionally worked as intended, but more often flooded the surrounding area and created what we might generously call wetlands. Windmills were more reliable in theory, but required constant adjustment as wind conditions changed. This meant that apprentice millers spent most of their time climbing onto mill structures to adjust sails, a practice that contributed to the medieval saying, "God protects drunks and mill workers," though medieval statistics suggest that protection was sporadic. The fourth year of apprenticeship focused on malting, the process of converting grain starches into fermentable sugars. This involved soaking grain in water until it sprouted, then heating it in kilns to stop the sprouting process at exactly the right moment. Timing was critical, and apprentices who misjudged the process could destroy entire batches of grain, leading to what medieval records describe as vigorous correction. Years 5 and 6 covered actual brewing, which was surprisingly complex for a process that medieval people attributed to supernatural forces. Apprentices learned to judge the temperature of water by sight and touch. Thermometers would not be invented for several centuries, and to determine the proper proportions of grain, water, and whatever mysterious substances local tradition demanded. The mysterious substances varied by region but typically included herbs with names like ground ivy, sweet gale, and bog myrtle. These herbs served multiple purposes. They added flavor, acted as preservatives, and occasionally poisoned customers. The exact recipes were closely guarded secrets passed down through families, though this secrecy may have been more about hiding mistakes than protecting valuable knowledge. Year 7 of apprenticeship was devoted to learning business practices, which in medieval times meant mastering the arts of bribery, tax evasion, and creative accounting. Apprentices learned to keep multiple sets of books, one for tax collectors, one for guild inspectors, and one that recorded what actually happened. They also learned the delicate art of watering down ale without making it undrinkable, a skill that required considerable finesse. Upon completion of their apprenticeship, aspiring brewers could apply for guild membership by demonstrating their skills in a public examination called a masterpiece trial. This involved brewing a batch of ale under the supervision of established masters, who judged the final product according to criteria that were never clearly defined and often contradicted each other. Successful candidates paid their guild fees and received a certificate written in Latin that they couldn't read, officially designating them as master brewers. They also received a guild mark, a symbol they could burn into their barrels to indicate guild membership and presumably to discourage counterfeiting, though medieval enforcement of intellectual property rights was inconsistent. Guild masters were required to follow numerous regulations governing everything from ingredients to pricing to the acceptable level of mouse droppings in the final product. The mouse droppings regulation, incidentally, allowed for modest contamination, as long as it didn't exceed what might reasonably be expected given local conditions. Medieval food safety standards were refreshingly practical. The guild also regulated working hours, though medieval concepts of time were fluid. Most brewers worked from sunrise to sunset, with breaks for meals, prayer, and what medieval people called necessary functions. The exact duration of these breaks was a subject of constant negotiation between masters and apprentices. During the Christmas season, we're getting closer to our actual topic, I promise, guild regulations were temporarily relaxed to allow for increased production. Christmas was one of the few times of year when medieval people consumed alcohol for pleasure rather than mere survival, leading to what economists would now call a seasonal demand spike. This increased demand created opportunities for illegal brewing operations run by what guild records refer to as unlicensed persons of questionable character. These entrepreneurs operated from private homes, abandoned buildings, and occasionally from caves, producing ale that ranged from barely acceptable to potentially fatal. The guild responded to this competition through a combination of legal action, physical intimidation, and strategic bribery of local officials. Medieval law enforcement was essentially freelance, with constables paid by whoever could afford their services. This created a market for justice that resembled modern insurance claims adjusting more than modern policing. Guild-approved Christmas ale was supposed to meet specific quality standards, though these standards were described in terminology that defies modern translation. Ale was required to be wholesome, of good color, and free from corruption, terms that apparently meant something to medieval people, but provide little guidance to contemporary readers. The good color requirement was particularly problematic because medieval ale ranged from pale yellow to dark brown, depending on the grains used, the brewing process, and the phase of the moon when the brewing occurred. Guild inspectors judged color by holding samples up to candlelight and comparing them to previous batches that had been deemed acceptable, a method that was both subjective and dependent on the quality of the available candles. The wholesome requirement was even more subjective. Wholesome ale was supposed to have a pleasant aroma, though medieval definitions of pleasant differed significantly from contemporary ones. Ale that smelled like wet hay was considered acceptable. Ale that smelled like rotten eggs was questionable. Ale that smelled like dead fish was definitely unwholesome, though customers sometimes drank it anyway. The prohibition against corruption covered a wide range of problems, including bacterial contamination, deliberate adulteration, and what medieval people called evil influences. Evil influences included brewing during thunderstorms, using water from cursed wells, and allowing menstruating women to participate in the brewing process. Medieval brewing combined chemistry, biology, and demonology in ways that modern science finds difficult to evaluate. Christmas ale was typically stronger than regular ale, though medieval measurements of alcohol content were impressionistic. Strong ale was ale that made people drunk faster than usual. Very strong ale was ale that made people unconscious. Extremely strong ale was ale that made people consider becoming monks, though this effect was usually temporary. The brewing of Christmas ale began in November, allowing time for fermentation and aging. This timing was critical because medieval brewing was dependent on ambient temperature, and winter brewing produced different results than summer brewing. Winter ale was typically cloudier and more acidic, characteristics that medieval people associated with seasonal appropriateness. Many taverns advertised their Christmas ale with signs that illustrated their claims through pictures rather than words, since most of their customers couldn't read. These signs typically depicted ale barrels surrounded by symbols representing the holiday season, holly leaves, stars, and occasionally religious imagery that may or may not have been theologically sound. The most common Christmas ale sign was a painted barrel with a star above it, though the symbolism of this image was probably lost on most medieval people. Some taverns used more elaborate signs featuring entire nativity scenes, complete with wise men bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and what appears to be ale barrels. The theological implications of this imagery were apparently not considered. Problematic. We must pause here to examine the broader economic context of medieval Christmas celebrations, because understanding the financial implications of holiday drinking is essential to grasping the social dynamics of tavern Christmas parties. Or at least, that's what I'm going to tell you to justify the next 1,000 words of economic history that you probably don't need to know. Medieval people had complex attitudes toward money that combined practical necessity with religious doctrine in ways that created interesting contradictions. The church taught that excessive concern with worldly wealth was sinful, but also required parishioners to pay tithes, fees, and various other charges that suggested a detailed understanding of worldly wealth. Christmas created additional financial pressures because the season required gift-giving, charitable donations, and increased consumption of food and drink. These expenses came at the worst possible time of year, after harvest was completed, and before spring planting could begin, when most medieval people had the least amount of disposable income. The result was a seasonal credit economy that operated through a combination of formal lending, informal favors, and what medieval people called Christmas trusts. Christmas trusts were agreements to pay for holiday expenses after the next harvest, assuming the next harvest was successful and the borrower survived the winter. Tavern keepers participated in this credit economy by allowing regular customers to run tabs during the Christmas season. These tabs were recorded in tally sticks, pieces of wood with notches cut to represent amounts owed that were split between creditor and debtor. The tally stick system worked surprisingly well, assuming both parties could count and neither party deliberately destroyed their half of the stick. Christmas tabs typically covered not only ale, but also food, lodging, and various services that taverns provided beyond mere drinking. Many taverns rented sleeping space in lofts above the main room, charging by the night and providing what medieval people optimistically called bedding. This bedding usually consisted of straw that had been used by previous guests and may or may not have been changed since the previous Christmas season. Lodging customers were expected to provide their own blankets and pillows, leading to a robust market in portable bedding that doubled as travel gear. Medieval travelers carried what they called sleep rolls, basically cloth sacks filled with whatever soft materials they could find. The quality of these materials varied widely, and experienced travelers learned to check their sleep rolls regularly for insects, mold, and small animals that had taken up residence. The Christmas season also created opportunities for tavern keepers to provide specialized services such as letter writing for illiterate customers who wanted to send holiday greetings to distant relatives. These letters typically followed standard formulas that professional scribes had memorized, beginning with elaborate religious invocations and ending with requests for money. Professional scribes charged by the word, leading to a distinctive style of medieval correspondence that can only be described as aggressively verbose. Simple messages like "I am well" were expanded into elaborate passages describing the writer's physical health, spiritual condition, and relationship with various saints who were presumably monitoring the situation. Christmas letters also included detailed weather reports, crop assessments, and updates on local political situations that the recipient probably didn't care about, but that helped justify the scribe's fees. A typical Christmas letter might spend 3 paragraphs describing the condition of the local roads before mentioning that the writer's spouse had died in November, information that was relegated to a subordinate clause. But we're getting distracted by medieval correspondence practices, which are fascinating but not directly relevant to our discussion of tavern Christmas parties. Let me redirect your attention to the actual celebration customs, which we'll examine in excruciating detail after we finish discussing the regulatory framework governing holiday entertainment. Liking this video won't make it more interesting, but we appreciate the irony. Now we approach the moment you've been waiting for. If you're still capable of waiting for anything after an hour of medieval brewing regulations. The actual Christmas celebrations in medieval taverns, the culmination of centuries of tradition, guild regulation, and questionable hygiene practices. The event that will finally justify the last 60 minutes of background information that seemed completely irrelevant, but was, I assure you, absolutely essential to understanding what happened when medieval people gathered in dimly lit rooms to celebrate the birth of Christ while consuming fermented grain products. But first, and I know what you're thinking, but this is genuinely important, we must examine the specific customs that governed Christmas entertainment in licensed drinking establishments during the period from approximately 1200 to 1400 AD. Because without understanding these customs, the actual parties would seem completely incomprehensible, rather than merely boring. Medieval Christmas entertainment was regulated by a complex system of ecclesiastical and secular laws that attempted to balance religious observance with popular demand for activities that were technically sinful, but practically inevitable. The Church's position on Christmas revelry was officially one of cautious disapproval, combined with strategic blindness, a policy that allowed religious authorities to maintain doctrinal purity while avoiding the practical problems of actually enforcing their stated beliefs. The key document governing Christmas entertainment was the Lateran Council Decree of 1215, which established guidelines for appropriate holiday behavior. These guidelines were sufficiently vague to allow for multiple interpretations, ensuring that local authorities could implement them according to their own preferences and financial interests. According to the decree, Christmas celebrations should be moderate in scope, devout in spirit, and beneficial to the community. This language was interpreted differently in different regions. In some areas, moderate meant no more than 3 consecutive days of drinking. In other areas, it meant no drinking before noon. In a few particularly strict regions, It meant no drinking of ale that was stronger than what children typically consumed, though this restriction was so unpopular that it was rarely enforced. The devout in spirit requirement was satisfied by beginning each day's celebrations with prayers, though these prayers were often perfunctory and sometimes inaudible due to the acoustic challenges of crowded taverns and the enthusiasm of the participants. The prayers typically invoked divine blessing on the gathering, requested protection from various dangers, and asked for forgiveness in advance for whatever was about to happen. Beneficial to the community was the most flexible requirement, since almost any activity could be justified as community building. Sharing ale was clearly beneficial to the community. Singing songs together built community bonds. Even arguments and fights were sometimes defended as forms of community participation, though this interpretation was not universally accepted. Local variations in Christmas celebration customs were significant. In northern England, Christmas tavern parties featured a tradition called wassailing, which involved singing songs while carrying bowls of spiced ale from table to table. The songs were typically religious in nature, though their religious content was sometimes difficult to detect due to regional dialects and the effects of alcohol consumption. Wassailing songs followed traditional melodies that had been passed down through oral tradition, meaning that different regions had different versions of the same songs. This created interesting situations when travelers from different areas attempted to wassail together, resulting in musical collaborations that sounded like what modern people might charitably describe as experimental. The wassailing bowl itself was an important element of the tradition. These bowls were typically made of wood, decorated with seasonal symbols, and passed from person to person throughout the evening. The contents of the wassailing bowl were spiced ale mixed with various ingredients that differed by region, and availability. Common wassailing bowl additives included honey, which sweetened the ale and presumably made it more palatable. Cinnamon was added when available, though medieval cinnamon was expensive and often adulterated with substances that were cheaper but not necessarily safer. Nutmeg was considered especially festive, though medieval nutmeg was occasionally replaced with ground acorns when actual nutmeg was unavailable. Some regions added eggs to their wassailing bowls, creating a beverage that resembled modern eggnog but tasted like disappointment. The eggs were supposed to be fresh, but medieval refrigeration was non-existent, and the freshness of eggs was determined by smell and visual inspection methods that were not always reliable. Other regional ingredients included apples, which were sliced and added to the bowl for flavor and symbolic significance. Apples represented prosperity, fertility, and the hope that next year's harvest would be better than this year's harvest. The apples also provided texture to the wassailing bowl contents, though this texture was not always pleasant. In southern England, Christmas tavern celebrations featured a different tradition called mumming, which involved performers wearing masks and costumes while acting out traditional stories. Mummers were typically local residents who had volunteered for the role, though volunteered often meant they had lost bets or owed favors to the tavern keeper. Mumming performances were highly stylized and followed scripts that had been passed down through generations of performers who couldn't read and therefore had to memorize everything. This oral transmission system ensured that mumming scripts evolved over time, with each generation of performers adding their own interpretations and occasionally forgetting important plot points. The most popular mumming story was the battle between St. George and the Turkish Knight, a narrative that combined religious symbolism, patriotic sentiment, and violence in proportions that appealed to medieval audiences. The story typically ended with St. George defeating the Turkish Knight through divine intervention, though some versions featured different outcomes depending on local political sympathies. Mumming performances were accompanied by music provided by whatever musicians were available and sober enough to play their instruments. Medieval tavern musicians were typically semi-professional, meaning they had other jobs, but played music for additional income during the Christmas season. The instruments used in tavern performances included drums made from animal skins, stretched over wooden frames, pipes made from hollowed wood or bone, and stringed instruments that resembled modern guitars but sounded like cats in distress. The quality of these instruments varied widely, and tuning was often a matter of personal preference rather than musical theory. Musical performances in medieval taverns followed no particular schedule. Musicians played when they felt like it, when customers requested songs, or when they needed to earn enough money to pay for their own drinks. This created an unpredictable musical environment where silence might be interrupted by sudden bursts of enthusiastic, but not necessarily competent performance. Song selection was limited by the musicians' repertoires, which typically included religious hymns, popular ballads, and drinking songs that celebrated the virtues of alcohol consumption. Religious hymns were performed during the early evening, when customers were still relatively sober and capable of pretending to be devout. Popular ballads told stories of heroic knights, tragic lovers, and supernatural events that may or may not have actually occurred. These stories were often long and complicated, with multiple verses that could extend a single song for 20 or 30 minutes. Customers who had heard the songs before sometimes joined in, creating group performances that were memorable for their enthusiasm rather than their musical quality. Drinking songs were performed later in the evening when customers had consumed enough ale to appreciate lyrics that celebrated the joys of intoxication. These songs typically featured refrains that were easy to remember and sing along with, even for people whose memory and coordination had been compromised by alcohol consumption. The most popular drinking song was "Bring Us Good Ale," a composition that praised ale as a solution to various life problems including hunger, cold, loneliness, and existential despair. The song's lyrics suggested that ale could cure diseases, improve marriages, and ensure salvation, claims that were probably not intended to be taken literally, but were enthusiastically endorsed by tavern customers. Another popular song was the "Alewife's Daughter," which told the story of a young woman whose beauty was surpassed only by her skill at brewing ale. The song described her various suitors and their attempts to win her affection through displays of ale consumption, creating a narrative that combined romance with product placement. Some regions had specialized Christmas drinking songs that were only performed during the holiday season. These songs typically combined religious themes with celebratory drinking, creating lyrics that were theologically questionable but emotionally satisfying. The most famous of these was "Christ was born on Christmas Day, so let's drink ale and be gay," a composition that modern listeners might find theologically simplistic. But we're approaching the actual moment of revelation, the specific details of what happened at medieval tavern Christmas parties, the culmination of all this historical background, the answer to the question you probably forgot you were supposed to be wondering about. And so we come to December 25th, 1347, in the village of Lesser Snodsbury, at the tavern known as the Prancing Pony. Not because anyone had ever seen a prancing pony, but because the sign painter had been paid in advance and refused to change his design when it was pointed out that the local horses were more inclined to standing still than prancing. The proprietress was one Marjorie Alewise, a widow of 37 years who had inherited the establishment from her late husband, along with his recipes, his debts, and his reputation for watering down the ale. Marjorie had improved the business by reducing the amount of water she added to each batch, though she had compensated by raising prices to maintain her profit margins. On this particular Christmas day, the Prancing Pony was filled to capacity, which meant that approximately 15 people were crowded into a room that was comfortable for 8. The customers included the local blacksmith, 2 farmers, a traveling merchant, a priest who was technically supposed to be conducting religious services, but had decided that spiritual needs could be met in taverns as well as churches, and several individuals whose occupations were matters of local speculation. The evening began, as all medieval tavern Christmas parties began, with prayer. Father Benedict, the priest who had chosen tavern ministry over traditional church services, led the assembled customers in a blessing that asked for divine protection during the evening's festivities and forgiveness for any sins that might be committed in the pursuit of Christmas joy. The prayer was followed by the ceremonial tapping of the Christmas ale barrel, a ritual that involved Marjorie hitting the barrel with a wooden mallet, while customers cheered with enthusiasm that was partly traditional and partly related to their anticipation of stronger than usual ale. The Christmas ale had been aging since November and had developed what Marjorie described as a robust character. Contemporary taste tests suggest that this character was primarily sour, though medieval palates were apparently more tolerant of sourness than modern ones. The first cups of Christmas ale were served to customers in order of social precedence, which meant that the priest received the first cup, the blacksmith received the second, and the farmers received cups 3 and 4. The traveling merchant, whose social status was unclear, received the 5th cup after a brief discussion about whether merchants ranked above or below farmers in the medieval social hierarchy. And then they had ale, not great ale, just ale. The drinking proceeded according to established patterns. Customers consumed their ale at rates that varied according to their tolerance, their resources, and their domestic situations. Married men drank slowly, knowing they would have to explain their condition to their wives. Unmarried men drank more quickly, having only their own judgment to answer to. The conversation during the first hour covered traditional topics: the weather, the harvest, local gossip, and theological questions that nobody was qualified to answer. But everyone had opinions about. The weather had been unusually wet. The harvest had been adequate but not exceptional. Local gossip involved speculation about which neighbors were conducting extramarital affairs and which were planning to leave the village without paying their debts. The theological discussions focused on questions such as whether animals had souls, whether unbaptized babies went to heaven or hell, and whether it was sinful to enjoy Christmas celebrations too much. These discussions typically ended without resolution, but with increased drinking, suggesting that ale was considered a valid theological methodology. If you've made it this far, you clearly need a hobby. Consider subscribing. Let us now examine, in microscopic detail, the specific moment when Father Benedict raised his wooden cup, carved from oak that had grown in the forest of Arden before being cut down by a woodsman named Hugh the Unfortunate, who received his surname after losing 3 fingers to an poorly maintained axe, and proposed the first toast of the evening. The toast was traditional: "To Christ our Saviour, born this day in Bethlehem." This 11-word sentence requires approximately 30 minutes of historical context to fully understand, because nothing in medieval life was simple, including expressions of religious devotion. The word Christ was pronounced differently in medieval England than it is today. The ch sound was harder, more guttural, resembling the sound modern people make when attempting to dislodge food from their throats. This pronunciation had theological significance that medieval people understood, but that has been lost to modern scholarship, partly because medieval pronunciation is difficult to reconstruct, and partly because modern scholars have better things to do. R was a possessive pronoun that carried complex implications in medieval society. When Father Benedict said "our Saviour," he was asserting collective ownership of Christ that included everyone present in the tavern, regardless of their individual spiritual conditions. This was theologically progressive for the period, since many medieval theologians argued that Christ belonged primarily to the clergy and was only available to lay people through ecclesiastical mediation. Saviour was a title that medieval people understood differently than modern Christians do. Medieval salvation was transactional, involving specific actions, payments, and spiritual accountings that resembled modern insurance claims more than modern religious experience. Medieval people believed that salvation could be earned through good works, purchased through donations, or inherited through family connections, creating a spiritual economy that was surprisingly complex. The phrase, "born this day," created temporal problems that medieval people solved through theological flexibility. Most medieval people didn't know the exact date of Christ's birth and weren't particularly concerned about historical accuracy. This day meant December 25th in the current year, which was 1347 according to the calendar system then in use, though different regions used different dating systems, and the actual accuracy of any medieval calendar was questionable. Medieval calendars were based on agricultural cycles, religious observances, and astronomical observations that were often incorrect. The Julian calendar, which was officially in use, had accumulated several days of error by the 14th century. meaning that December 25th probably didn't correspond to any historically accurate date related to Christ's birth. This didn't bother medieval people, who viewed historical accuracy as less important than spiritual significance. Bethlehem was a place that most medieval people had heard of, but couldn't locate on a map, partly because medieval maps were rare, and partly because medieval geography was largely theoretical. Most medieval people knew that Bethlehem was in the Holy Land, which was somewhere east of their current location, but beyond that their geographical knowledge became vague. The Holy Land existed in medieval consciousness as both a real place and a spiritual concept. Pilgrims who had actually traveled to Jerusalem sometimes returned with descriptions that contradicted each other, leading to confusion about whether Bethlehem was a city, a village, or a metaphysical state. This confusion didn't affect the spiritual significance of mentioning Bethlehem in toasts, but it did lead to interesting theological discussions. Father Benedict's pronunciation of Bethlehem reflected his education at the monastery school of St. Swithin's, where he had learned Latin pronunciation from monks who had learned it from other monks, in an unbroken chain of linguistic transmission that probably contained multiple errors. Medieval Latin pronunciation varied by region and institution, creating a language that resembled classical Latin the way that medieval ale resembled modern beer. The act of toasting itself had pre-Christian origins that the Church had officially condemned but practically accepted. Toasting was believed to invoke supernatural protection for the people participating in the toast, a belief that combined pagan superstition with Christian theology in ways that medieval people found comfortable, but that modern theologians find problematic. Medieval toasts required specific physical gestures to be effective. Participants were supposed to raise their cups simultaneously, make eye contact with each other, and drink at the same time. These requirements created coordination challenges in crowded taverns where visibility was limited and synchronization was difficult to achieve. The coordination problems were compounded by the fact that medieval cups were different sizes and shapes, making simultaneous drinking practically impossible. Some customers drank quickly, others slowly, and a few used the toasting ritual as an opportunity to avoid drinking altogether by pretending to sip while actually doing nothing. The cups themselves deserve detailed examination because medieval drinking vessels reflected complex social hierarchies and economic relationships that affected the dynamics of tavern Christmas parties. Father Benedict's cup was made of wood that had been carved by Brother Aldrich, a monk who supplemented the monastery's income by producing utilitarian objects for local customers. Brother Aldrich's woodworking skills were adequate but not exceptional. His cups were functional and reasonably durable, but they lacked the decorative elements that marked high-quality craftsmanship. The wood was usually oak, which was abundant in local forests and had symbolic associations with strength and endurance that appealed to medieval customers. The carving process involved tools that Brother Aldrich had inherited from the previous monastery woodworker, along with techniques he had learned through trial and error. Medieval woodworking education was largely practical, with apprentices learning by observing masters and making mistakes until they achieved competence. Brother Aldrich's cups typically took 2 days to complete, including time for the wood to dry and for the carving to be finished to acceptable standards. The pricing reflected both the labor involved and the monastery's financial needs, which varied according to seasonal donations and the cost of maintaining medieval religious institutions. The blacksmith, whose name was Thomas but who was known to everyone as Tom Ironbender, drank from a pewter cup that he had acquired through what medieval people called trade arrangements. Tom had provided metalworking services to a traveling merchant in exchange for the cup, creating a barter transaction that avoided the need for money. Medieval barter systems were complex networks of mutual obligation that allowed people to exchange goods and services without currency. These systems worked well in small communities, where everyone knew everyone else's skills and needs, but they became complicated when travelers introduced goods from other regions. Tom's pewter cup was probably made from tin that had been mined in Cornwall and mixed with lead that had been mined in the Mendip Hills, though the exact origins of the metals were unknown to Tom and probably unknowable to modern historians. Medieval supply chains were informal networks that moved goods through multiple intermediaries, making it difficult to trace products to their sources. The pewter had been cast in a mold that showed signs of repeated use, creating slight irregularities in the cup's shape that gave it what modern collectors would call character. Medieval people were accustomed to handmade goods that showed evidence of their manufacturing process, and they didn't expect the uniformity that modern industrial production achieves. The lead content in medieval pewter varied widely and was sometimes high enough to cause what modern medicine would recognize as lead poisoning. Medieval people attributed the symptoms of lead poisoning to various other causes, including bad air, evil influences, and divine punishment for sin, never suspecting that their drinking vessels might be slowly killing them. Tom Ironbender had been using his pewter cup for approximately 7 years, during which time he had consumed enough lead to cause what medieval people called melancholy, and modern doctors would call neurological damage. His melancholy manifested as occasional confusion, difficulty concentrating, and a tendency to forget conversations shortly after they occurred. These symptoms actually made Tom a popular drinking companion because he never remembered embarrassing things that other customers had said or done during previous tavern visits. Medieval people valued discretion, and Tom's lead-induced memory problems provided the medieval equivalent of attorney-client privilege. The farmers, whose names were William and Geoffrey, but who were distinguished by their heights, William the tall and Geoffrey the short, shared a single clay cup that they had made themselves using techniques passed down through their families. Clay cups were cheaper than wooden ones, and much cheaper than pewter ones, making them suitable for people whose incomes depended on agricultural success. Medieval agriculture was unpredictable, with crop yields varying according to weather conditions, soil quality, pest infestations, and what medieval people attributed to divine favor or disfavor. Good years produced surplus crops that could be sold for cash. Bad years produced barely enough food for survival, leaving no money for luxuries like individual drinking cups. William and Geoffrey had experienced 3 good years, followed by 2 bad years, putting them in a financial position that medieval economists would have described as precarious if medieval economists had existed. They owned their land jointly, having inherited it from their father, who had died of what medieval people called sweating sickness, and modern doctors would probably diagnose as influenza. The shared cup represented their shared financial situation and their practical approach to unnecessary expenses. Medieval people wasted nothing, and buying 2 cups when one would suffice was considered evidence of pride, which was sinful, or stupidity, which was expensive. The clay from which their cup was made had been dug from a pit behind their cottage, mixed with water from their well, and shaped using techniques that had remained unchanged for centuries. The clay had then been fired in their hearth using wood from trees they had cut themselves, creating a cup that represented complete local self-sufficiency. Medieval self-sufficiency was both an economic necessity and a source of pride. People who could provide for themselves without depending on markets, merchants, or monetary systems had achieved a form of independence that medieval society valued highly. This independence was often illusory, since medieval people depended on each other for many things, but the illusion was psychologically important. The traveling merchant, who claimed his name was Robert, but whose accent suggested he might be lying about either his name or his place of origin, drank from a leather vessel that he carried in his pack. Leather drinking vessels were practical for travelers because they were lightweight, unbreakable, and could be folded flat when not in use. The leather had been treated with substances that made it waterproof, but gave it a taste that most people found unpleasant. Medieval leather treatment involved animal urine, tree bark, and various other materials that were effective preservatives, but created flavors that modern people would find unacceptable. Robert's drinking vessel had been made by a leather worker in a city whose name he couldn't pronounce correctly, using techniques that differed from local methods. This made the vessel interesting to the other tavern customers, who examined it carefully and asked questions about its construction and origin. Medieval people were curious about foreign goods and manufacturing techniques, partly because they encountered them rarely, and partly because they were always looking for ways to improve their own methods. Technological innovation in medieval times typically involved borrowing ideas from other regions rather than developing completely new approaches. The leather vessel held approximately the same amount of liquid as the other customers' cups, though its irregular shape made precise measurement impossible. Medieval people weren't concerned with precise measurements in social situations, preferring approximate equality to mathematical accuracy. Robert claimed that his leather vessel had been blessed by a bishop in Canterbury, making it spiritually superior to ordinary drinking cups. This claim was probably false, since bishops rarely blessed personal possessions belonging to merchants, but medieval people enjoyed stories about religious relics and blessed objects. The concept of blessed drinking vessels appealed to medieval sensibilities because it combined practical utility with spiritual significance. A cup that had been blessed by ecclesiastical authority was not only functional, but also potentially capable of providing supernatural protection to its user. Whether Robert's vessel had actually been blessed was less important than whether people believed it had been blessed. Medieval religion operated partly through belief and partly through ritual, with the effectiveness of both depending more on faith than on factual accuracy. And now we come to the moment when all 6 customers simultaneously raised their respective drinking vessels, wood, pewter, clay, and blessed leather, in response to Father Benedict's toast. This moment lasted approximately 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained centuries of history, tradition, and cultural significance that we have only begun to examine. The synchronized lifting of cups created a brief moment of unity among people who were otherwise divided by social class, economic status, and personal circumstances. For 3 seconds, the priest and the farmers shared the same ritual purpose. The blacksmith and the merchant participated in the same symbolic action. Medieval social hierarchies were temporarily suspended in favor of collective celebration. This suspension of hierarchy was one of the defining characteristics of medieval Christmas celebrations. During the Christmas season, normal social rules were relaxed to allow for activities that would be inappropriate at other times of year. Masters served their servants. Peasants sang songs to nobles. Clergy drank with lay people in taverns instead of leading them in prayers in churches. The temporary nature of this social inversion made it acceptable to medieval authorities, who understood that allowing controlled chaos prevented uncontrolled revolution. Christmas revelry served as a social safety valve that allowed medieval people to express frustrations and desires that were normally suppressed. But the moment of synchronized cup raising was also the moment when Father Benedict noticed something that would affect the rest of the evening's proceedings. Something that we have been building toward for the past 90 minutes, but that we still cannot reveal, because there are still 30 minutes of essential background information that you absolutely need to understand first. Patience. All will be revealed. Eventually subscribe if you're one of the 0.01% of humanity that made it this far. We have now reached the point in our narrative, and I use the term narrative with the same confidence one might have in medieval weather forecasting, where we must confront the fundamental absurdity of what we are doing. We have spent 2 hours discussing medieval tavern Christmas parties, and if you are still watching, you are either deeply committed to historical education or suffering from a medical condition that prevents you from making rational decisions about your time allocation. This part of the story is being told solely to reach our time target. There is no pretense otherwise. We are engaged in an exercise in collective futility, where I provide information you don't need about events that didn't matter, while you consume this information for reasons that neither of us fully understand. If you're still here, why? Medieval people would have found our behavior incomprehensible. They lived in a world where time was scarce, information was valuable, and entertainment served clear social purposes. They would not have understood the concept of spending 2 hours learning about their drinking habits, especially since they already knew about their drinking habits and were too busy drinking to worry about historical analysis. Yet, here we are, committed to this strange contract, where I continue talking and you continue listening, long after any reasonable person would have found something better to do. We have become trapped in a loop of mutual obligation that resembles medieval feudalism, more than modern entertainment consumption. Perhaps this is appropriate. Medieval people understood obligation in ways that modern people have forgotten. When you began watching this video, you entered into an unspoken agreement to see it through to the end, regardless of whether you were enjoying it or learning anything useful. This agreement has bound you here for 2 hours, and it will apparently keep you here for whatever time remains. Medieval social obligations worked similarly. When you accepted someone's hospitality, you became obligated to participate in their entertainment, no matter how tedious or incompetent that entertainment might be. Medieval people couldn't leave tavern parties early without offending their hosts, just as you apparently cannot stop watching this video without violating some internal commitment to completion. This creates an interesting parallel between medieval Christmas party attendance and modern YouTube viewing patterns. Both involve enduring experiences that are no longer providing pleasure in the hope that something worthwhile will eventually happen. Both require patience that exceeds reasonable expectations. Both test the limits of human tolerance for repetitive, pointless activity. Medieval people, however, had the advantage of alcohol to make their tedious experiences more bearable. You are presumably watching this sober, which means you are voluntarily subjecting yourself to boredom that medieval people would have considered a form of punishment. The medieval justice system did include punishments that involved forced attention to boring activities. Criminals were sometimes sentenced to listen to lengthy sermons, attend multiple religious services, or observe administrative proceedings that had no bearing on their cases. These punishments were considered effective deterrents, precisely because they were so unbearable, yet you continue watching, which suggests that modern people have developed a tolerance for boredom that exceeds medieval standards. This tolerance may be a byproduct of modern entertainment technology, which has created expectations of content consumption that prioritize duration over quality. Medieval entertainment was shorter and more intense. A typical tavern Christmas party lasted only a few hours and included activities that directly engaged participants. Nobody sat passively for 2 hours listening to someone else describe parties they hadn't attended. Medieval people would have considered such behavior evidence of mental illness. This raises disturbing questions about what we are doing and why we are doing it. Are we participating in a form of entertainment that medieval people would have recognized as torture? Are we demonstrating cognitive abilities that have somehow deteriorated since the 14th century? Are we fulfilling psychological needs that medieval people satisfied through more efficient methods? These questions have no satisfactory answers, which is probably why you're still here. The search for meaning in meaningless activities is a fundamentally modern problem. Medieval people didn't worry about whether their activities were meaningful because they were too busy surviving to engage in existential analysis. Medieval Christmas parties served clear purposes. They provided social bonding, stress relief, and temporary escape from harsh living conditions. Everyone who attended received immediate, tangible benefits that justified the time and effort involved. The entertainment was interactive, the food was real, and the alcohol was effective. This video serves no clear purpose. You are not bonding with anyone, since you're presumably watching alone. You are not relieving stress, since boredom typically increases stress levels. You are not escaping from harsh living conditions, since modern living conditions are demonstrably better than medieval ones. Yet you continue watching, which suggests that purposeless activity has become its own form of purpose. You are watching precisely because it serves no function, fulfills no need, and provides no benefit. The absence of meaning has become meaningful. The lack of purpose has become purposeful. This is a profoundly modern phenomenon that medieval people would have found incomprehensible. Medieval society was organized around clear hierarchies, defined roles, and specific obligations. Every activity was supposed to serve either practical or spiritual purposes. Time wasting was considered sinful, both because time belonged to God and because medieval people had so little of it. Medieval Christmas parties maximized efficiency by combining multiple purposes in single activities. Drinking provided both pleasure and social bonding. Singing provided both entertainment and religious expression. Dancing provided both physical exercise and courtship opportunities. Every element of medieval celebrations served multiple functions. This video serves negative functions. It wastes time that could be used productively. It provides information that serves no practical purpose. It creates expectations that cannot be fulfilled and answers questions that nobody asked. It is anti-entertainment that achieves the opposite of what entertainment is supposed to achieve. Yet its anti-entertainment qualities have apparently become entertaining. Its purposelessness has attracted an audience that finds purpose in purposelessness. Its failure to provide satisfaction has somehow become satisfying to people who have exhausted conventional sources of satisfaction. This suggests that modern entertainment consumption has evolved beyond medieval comprehension. We have developed the ability to find value in activities that provide no value, to enjoy experiences that provide no enjoyment, and to complete tasks that accomplish nothing. Medieval people would have admired this ability if they had understood it. They lived in a world where most experiences were unpleasant, most tasks were difficult, and most accomplishments were temporary. The ability to find entertainment in boring activities would have been a valuable survival skill in medieval society. But medieval people never developed this ability because they never needed it. Their entertainment was genuinely entertaining because they had so little of it. Their activities were genuinely purposeful because purposeless activity was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their time was genuinely valuable because they had so little of it to waste. Modern people have somehow achieved the opposite condition. We have so much entertainment that genuine entertainment has become difficult to recognize. We have so many purposeful activities available that purposeless activity has acquired novelty value. We have so much time available that wasting time has become a form of conspicuous consumption. This video represents the logical conclusion of these developments. It is entertainment that actively avoids being entertaining. It is activity that celebrates inactivity. It is time consumption that acknowledges its own wastefulness while continuing to consume time anyway. The medieval Christmas party that we have been supposedly describing would have ended hours ago. Medieval people had limited attention spans, reasonable expectations about entertainment quality, and practical obligations that prevented them from engaging in extended, pointless activities. You, however, have remained here for over 2 hours listening to descriptions of events that may not have happened, analyzing customs that probably weren't important, and waiting for revelations that will almost certainly disappoint you. This behavior would have baffled medieval people, who understood that life was short and entertainment should be efficient. Yet perhaps your behavior demonstrates an evolution in human consciousness that medieval people never achieved. You have transcended the need for entertainment to be entertaining. You have developed appreciation for experiences that provide no conventional rewards. You have achieved a Zen-like acceptance of meaninglessness that medieval people, with their desperate search for purpose and meaning, never managed. Or perhaps you have simply been hypnotized by the rhythm of meaningless information delivery, trapped in a cycle of expectation and disappointment that resembles medieval purgatory more than modern entertainment. Perhaps you continue watching, not because you are enjoying it, but because you have forgotten how to stop. Medieval people understood the concept of purgatory as a state of suspended animation where souls waited indefinitely for something that might never happen. This video may have created a secular version of purgatory where viewers wait indefinitely for content that might never arrive. The difference is that medieval purgatory was supposed to end eventually, when souls had been sufficiently purified to enter heaven. This video's purgatory has no clear endpoint and no purification process. It simply continues until you develop the courage or wisdom to make it stop. But you haven't stopped, which suggests that secular purgatory has become preferable to whatever alternatives are available. Perhaps modern life has become so complex and demanding that voluntary boredom provides relief from involuntary stimulation. Perhaps you are here because this is the only place where nothing is expected of you except passive endurance. Medieval Christmas parties expected active participation. Guests were supposed to sing, dance, tell stories, and engage in social interactions that required energy, creativity, and interpersonal skills. Medieval entertainment was work that disguised itself as pleasure. This video expects nothing except your attention, and even that attention can be partial and distracted. You can listen while doing other things, watch while thinking about other subjects, and participate without actually participating. It is pleasure that disguises itself as work, or perhaps work that has given up pretending to be pleasure. The medieval people in our hypothetical tavern would have finished their celebration and gone home to lives that were difficult but comprehensible. You will finish this video and return to a life that is easier but perhaps less comprehensible. This trade-off may explain why you are here instead of there. We are now approaching the final 30 minutes of this exercise in mutual endurance. The medieval Christmas party that we have been theoretically describing is about to reach its climax, which will be as anticlimactic as everything else we have experienced together. Medieval people understood that all parties end, all entertainment concludes, and all experiences become memories that fade over time. They would have found comfort in this knowledge because it meant that even boring experiences would eventually become bearable through the simple passage of time. You are about to discover whether modern people have retained this medieval wisdom, or whether we have evolved beyond the need for experiences to actually end. If you've made it this far, you clearly have transcended normal human limitations. We salute your dedication to meaninglessness. And now, after 2.5 hours of build-up that has tested the limits of human patience and the boundaries of rational content consumption, we arrive at the moment Father Benedict noticed during the synchronized cup-raising ceremony, the detail that would define the rest of the evening, the revelation that justifies everything we have endured together. Father Benedict observed that Thomas Ironbender's pewter cup had a small dent in its rim. That's it. A dent, approximately 3 millimeters in diameter, caused most likely by the cup being dropped on a stone floor at some point during its 7-year history of use. The dent was barely visible in the flickering candlelight and had no effect on the cup's functionality. But medieval people paid attention to details that modern people would ignore, partly because they had fewer distractions and partly because small flaws in manufactured goods were considered significant. A dented cup suggested careless handling, which reflected poorly on its owner's character. Medieval society was built on reputation, and reputation could be damaged by something as minor as drinking from flawed vessels. Father Benedict's observation of the dent created a moment of social awkwardness that affected the dynamics of the entire evening. Thomas Ironbender became self-conscious about his cup, which made him drink more slowly and participate less enthusiastically in conversations. The other customers noticed his changed behavior, which made them examine their own drinking vessels for similar flaws. William the Tall discovered a hairline crack in the clay cup he shared with Geoffrey the Short. Geoffrey noticed that the crack extended further than he had previously realized, suggesting that their cup might break during the evening's festivities. This possibility created anxiety about whether they would be able to continue participating in the party if their cup became unusable. The traveling merchant Robert began boasting more loudly about his blessed leather vessel, emphasizing its spiritual superiority over ordinary cups as compensation for its unpleasant taste. His increased boasting annoyed the other customers, who had been willing to tolerate his stories about bishops and blessings when he told them modestly, but found them irritating when delivered with obvious pride. Father Benedict realized that his casual observation had disrupted the social harmony of the Christmas celebration, but medieval etiquette provided no mechanism for retracting observations that had already been made. Once something had been noticed and acknowledged, it became part of the social reality of the situation and had to be dealt with according to established customs. The established custom for dealing with flawed drinking vessels was for other customers to pretend not to notice while the owner of the flawed vessel either explained how the flaw occurred or offered to obtain a replacement. Thomas Ironbender chose to explain, launching into a detailed account of how his cup had been damaged during a dispute with his neighbor about property boundaries. The property boundary dispute had occurred 3 years earlier and involved a strip of land approximately 6 inches wide that lay between Thomas's workshop and his neighbor's garden. The neighbor, whose name was Edmund the Argumentative, claimed that Thomas had been using the disputed strip to store iron bars without permission. Thomas maintained that the strip had always been part of his property and that Edmund's garden had gradually expanded onto land that rightfully belonged to the blacksmith's workshop. The dispute had escalated through various stages of medieval conflict resolution, including discussions with mutual friends, consultation with village elders, and eventually a formal hearing before the local manor court. The manor court hearing had lasted most of a day and involved testimony from witnesses who remembered the original property boundaries from when they had been established decades earlier. Medieval people had excellent memories for land boundaries because property disputes were common, and land ownership was often the difference between survival and starvation. The court's decision had favored Thomas, but only by a narrow margin that left both parties dissatisfied with the outcome. Edmund was required to remove his garden vegetables from the disputed strip, while Thomas was required to pay court costs and provide compensation for the vegetables that had to be destroyed. The cup had been dented during the celebration of Thomas's legal victory when he had raised it in a toast and accidentally struck it against a low-ceiling beam in his workshop. The irony of damaging his cup while celebrating a property dispute was not lost on Thomas, who interpreted it as a sign that legal victories were often accompanied by unexpected costs. This 7-minute explanation of the cup's dent provided more entertainment than anything else that had happened during the evening, because it involved local people and events that the other customers could relate to and comment upon. Medieval people were intensely interested in their neighbors' affairs, partly because they had few other sources of information and entertainment. The story of the property dispute led to discussions of other local conflicts, including a disagreement between two farmers about the ownership of a pig, a dispute between the village baker and a customer about the quality of bread, and an ongoing argument between the church and the manor about the repair of the parish roof. These discussions consumed the next hour of the Christmas party, with each customer contributing stories about conflicts they had witnessed, participated in, or heard about from reliable sources. Medieval people were excellent storytellers because they had plenty of practice and captive audiences who were genuinely interested in local gossip. The pig ownership dispute involved a sow that had wandered between two farms and given birth to piglets while visiting the neighbor's property. The question was whether the piglets belonged to the owner of the mother pig or the owner of the property where they had been born. Medieval law provided conflicting precedents, leading to a dispute that had lasted longer than the piglets' natural lifespans. The bread quality dispute involved accusations that the baker was adulterating flour with sawdust to increase his profits. The customer claimed that recent loaves had contained visible wood particles, while the baker maintained that the particles were grain husks that proved he was using high-quality ingredients rather than refined flour. The church roof dispute centered on whether the manor was financially responsible for maintaining church property, or whether the church should fund repairs through increased tithes and donations from parishioners. This dispute had theological implications because it involved questions about the relationship between secular and religious authority. These stories led to general discussions about the nature of justice in medieval society, the reliability of different types of evidence, and the effectiveness of various dispute resolution methods. Medieval people were surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of legal principles, perhaps because they encountered legal problems regularly and couldn't afford professional representation. The legal discussions were interrupted by the arrival of additional customers who had finished their own Christmas celebrations and wanted to continue drinking in a social environment. The new arrivals included two more farmers, a wool merchant, and a woman whose occupation was not specified, but who seemed to know everyone and have opinions about everything. The arrival of new customers required rearrangement of seating and redistribution of available space. Medieval taverns had no fire codes or occupancy limits, so customers continued crowding in until physical space was exhausted or the structural integrity of the building was threatened, whichever came first. The woman, whose name was Alice and who was known locally as Alice Knowall, immediately took control of the conversation by asking pointed questions about the various disputes that had been under discussion. Alice had strong opinions about all local conflicts and was not hesitant to share them with anyone who would listen. Alice's commentary on the pig dispute revealed that she was related to one of the disputants and had personal knowledge of the sow's breeding history, the layout of both farms, and the character flaws of both farmers. Her information transformed a simple story about animal ownership into a complex narrative involving family rivalries, past grievances, and sexual scandals that had occurred decades earlier. Medieval villages were small communities where everyone was related to everyone else through blood, marriage, or mutual antagonism. Personal conflicts often had histories that extended back generations and involved grievances that had been passed down through families like heirloom recipes for hatred. Alice's stories about local conflicts led to more stories from other customers, creating a cascade of gossip that revealed the complex web of relationships, obligations, and resentments that held medieval communities together while simultaneously tearing them apart. The wool merchant contributed stories about conflicts in other villages that he had visited during his travels, providing comparative perspective on local disputes. His story suggested that property boundary disagreements, animal ownership conflicts, and bread quality complaints were universal features of medieval life. Medieval people found comfort in learning that their problems were not unique. The knowledge that people in other villages were arguing about similar issues provided validation that their own conflicts were reasonable responses to universal human challenges rather than evidence of particular local deficiencies. The evening's conversation had evolved from religious celebration to social gossip to comparative sociology, demonstrating the medieval ability to find entertainment in ordinary human interactions. Medieval people didn't need professional entertainers or elaborate productions because they could create their own entertainment from the raw materials of daily life. And then, as all medieval Christmas parties eventually did, this one began to wind down. Customers finished their ale, paid their tabs, and prepared to return to homes that were colder and darker than the tavern, but offered the privacy and comfort that only domestic spaces could provide. Father Benedict led a final prayer, thanking God for the evening's fellowship and asking for protection during the journey home. Medieval people took night travel seriously because darkness concealed dangers ranging from wild animals to human thieves to supernatural entities that preferred to operate under cover of darkness. The prayer was followed by individual farewells. That followed complex protocols reflecting the social relationships between participants. People of higher status were bid farewell before people of lower status. Older people received more elaborate farewells than younger people. Married men were reminded to convey greetings to their wives. Thomas Iron Bender wrapped his dented pewter cup in a cloth and placed it carefully in his belt pouch, taking extra precautions to prevent further damage. The evening's discussion of the cup's dent had increased his awareness of its fragility and his determination to preserve it for future use. William the Tall and Geoffrey the Short examined their cracked clay cup one final time before deciding that it was still functional, enough to carry home safely. They would have to find a replacement before their next tavern visit, but for tonight the cup would serve its purpose. Robert the traveling merchant packed his blessed leather vessel with the care due to a religious relic, though whether his care was motivated by genuine reverence or practical concern for his property was unclear. Medieval people often found it difficult to distinguish between spiritual and material values because their society insisted that all material objects had spiritual significance, and so the Christmas party at the Prancing Pony ended as most medieval celebrations ended, not with dramatic climax or memorable conclusion, but with gradual dissolution as participants drifted away to resume their ordinary lives. Medieval people understood that celebrations were temporary interruptions in the normal pattern of existence, brief moments of joy that made the surrounding difficulties more bearable. The customers departed into a December night that was cold, dark, and filled with the usual medieval dangers. They walked home along paths they knew by memory, guided by starlight and the distant glow of other people's hearth fires, carrying the warmth of shared ale and companionship to sustain them through the winter night. Marjorie alewise cleaned the empty cups, banked the fire and secured the tavern against whatever threats the night might bring. She counted the evening's profits, which were adequate, but not exceptional, and reflected on the strange human need to gather together in uncomfortable spaces to consume fermented grain products while discussing other people's problems. Medieval. Christmas, like medieval life itself, was neither romantic nor dramatic. It was ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary circumstances, finding moments of happiness in situations that were mostly difficult, creating temporary communities in a world that was usually isolated and dangerous. That, dear viewer, is what medieval tavern Christmas parties were really like. Not magical gatherings of colorful characters sharing heartwarming moments, but practical responses to the human need for social connection in a world that made social connection difficult and dangerous. The hidden Christmas detail I mentioned at the beginning was this. Thomas Ironbender's dented cup contained a small piece of holly that had fallen from the tavern's seasonal decoration. He never noticed it, drank around it all evening, and carried it home still lodged in the bottom of his cup. It was discovered 3 days later when he cleaned the cup for the next use. Holly, symbol of Christ's crown of thorns, reminder of sacrifice and redemption, reduced to an unnoticed piece of debris in the bottom of a drinking vessel, owned by a man who was more concerned about property boundaries than theological significance. This is perhaps the most accurate representation of medieval Christmas that we can provide. Sacred symbols reduced to practical inconveniences, religious meaning overwhelmed by immediate concerns, spiritual significance lost in the daily struggle for survival and social acceptance. And that, dear viewer, is how the second cousin of a minor noble ended up owning a spoon factory that no longer exists. Thank you for your attention, or your endurance, or your surrender to forces beyond your control that kept you here for 3 hours, listening to someone describe events that may not have happened to people who probably didn't exist in a world that definitely no longer exists. Medieval. People would have understood your behavior perfectly. They spent their entire lives enduring experiences that provided no obvious benefit, fulfilling obligations that made no rational sense, and participating in systems that existed primarily because they had always existed. The difference is that medieval people had no choice. You chose this. You chose to spend 3 hours learning about medieval tavern Christmas parties when you could have been doing literally anything else. You chose to listen to detailed descriptions of property disputes involving people who died 7 centuries ago. You chose to endure explanations of brewing regulations that have no bearing on your life or anyone else's. This choice reveals something profound about modern human consciousness that medieval people never achieved: the ability to find meaning in meaninglessness, purpose in purposelessness, and entertainment in the deliberate absence of entertainment. Medieval Christmas parties served clear functions: social bonding, stress relief, religious observance, and community building. This video serves no clear function, except to demonstrate that functions are not necessary for human engagement. You have participated in a 3-hour experiment in collective pointlessness that would have baffled medieval people, but that apparently satisfies some deep modern need for experiences that acknowledge their own futility while continuing to exist anyway. Perhaps this is the ultimate evolution of human entertainment: content that is honest about its own meaninglessness, transparent about its waste of time, and unapologetic about providing nothing of value, while somehow managing to provide exactly what its audience needed. Medieval people sought meaning in everything because their lives were difficult, and meaning helped them endure difficulty. Modern people may have achieved such comfort that we can afford to seek meaninglessness as a luxury that medieval people never had access to. This video is meaningless luxury made possible by technological abundance, economic prosperity, and social stability that medieval people could never have imagined. You have spent 3 hours consuming nothing because you live in a world where consuming nothing is possible. Medieval people consumed everything because waste meant death. You have consumed nothing because waste has become leisure. This may be the most accurate Christmas gift we could offer: 3 hours of absolutely nothing, wrapped in the pretense of historical education, delivered to people who have everything. Accept the medieval ability to find satisfaction in simple pleasures. Merry Christmas. You have earned it by enduring what medieval people would have considered an unusually creative form of purgatory. The loop is now closed. The circle is complete. The nothing that became something has returned to nothing as promised. Thank you for watching, or surviving, or proving that human attention spans are either more resilient or more damaged than anyone previously suspected. Medieval people would salute your stamina. Modern people should question your judgment. But you're here, which means you've already made your choice about whose opinion matters more. Until next time, assuming there will be a next time, which depends on whether civilization has progressed far enough to make even longer exercises in pointless historical analysis seem like reasonable. Entertainment options. Subscribe if you want more nothing. We have plenty to offer.